2018, federal authorities didn't investigate the anomaly found on Mount Shasta. They buried it under tons of concrete. A Forest Service ranger, on a routine patrol of a remote slope, had stumbled upon something that shouldn't exist. A 60-foot shaft, dug straight down into solid volcanic rock. By hand. There were no tracks from heavy machinery, no piles of excavated earth. The diggers, when found, claimed they were following a low-frequency hum, a vibration from deep within the mountain, searching for an entrance. The official response was swift and absolute. Citing public safety hazards, the entire mystery was filled in, entombed. It forces you to wonder, what discovery was so dangerous it had to be permanently sealed from the world? But this concrete curtain isn't the beginning of the story. It's an echo. To understand what they were so desperate to hide, we have to go back. Back to a forgotten secret from 1904, and a man who found a different entrance. The year is 1904. The man who found that other entrance was named J.C. Brown, a British geologist prospecting for the Lord Cowdray Mining Company of London. His work was a solitary one, played out against the vast, silent backdrop of Mount Shasta. Days were spent in the grit and the sun, a predictable rhythm of surveying, mapping, and the steady metallic clink of a hammer against rock. It was a search for gold, a grounded and ordinary task. But on one of these ordinary days, his professional eye, trained to read the mountain's ancient geological story, caught a detail that felt like a misprint, a disturbance. It was a section of the rock face, camouflaged by a recent rock slide, but the arrangement felt deliberate, artificial. He got closer, his boots crunching on the loose scree. He ran his hand along a faint line in the stone, a seam too straight, too perfect to be natural. He wasn't thinking of treasure. He was a geologist, and this was an anomaly that defied the mountain's known formation. He pulled out his hammer, but instead of striking to break the rock, he tapped it. Gently. The sound that came back wasn't the dead thud of solid stone. It was a deep, hollow echo. A sound of emptiness where there should be millions of tons of solid mountain. Driven by a curiosity that now overshadowed his mission for gold, he found a purchase. He put his shoulder into it, pushing against what he later described as a giant boulder that appeared to be a door. For long minutes, nothing. Then, with a deep grinding protest of stone against stone, it moved. An opening appeared, a slice of absolute black against the bright California day. It wasn't a natural cave. The walls were smooth, carved with an unnatural, chilling precision, leading straight into the dark heart of the mountain. He lit his lantern, the small flame pushing back the immense darkness just a few feet. He took a breath and stepped across the threshold. And the first thing he noticed wasn't what he saw. It was the air. It wasn't the dead, stale air of a sealed tomb. It was cool, and it was moving. It felt fresh. That fresh air was a promise. This passage wasn't a dead end. It was a conduit. And so, J.C. Brown began to walk deeper into the mountain. The passage sloped downward at a steady, almost imperceptible gradient. As a geologist, he knew erosion didn't work like this. Water chews and undercuts. It collapses its own ceilings. It does not file stone into a perfect ramp. The walls met the floor in clean, unbroken lines. No ledges, no rubble. The surface under his palm smoother than any bedding plane. This wasn't a cave. It behaved like a corridor someone had surveyed and cut. He walked for what felt like hours. The yellow circle of his lamp stayed at the same unchanging angle, always down, his boots keeping an automatic stride. His calves burned, then his knees. An ache that said miles were passing while the tunnel neither widened nor bent. He kept glancing back, measuring the slope, calculating how long it would take to climb it again, and feeling, with a tightening in his chest, that turning back was no longer simple. The only sound was the steady echo of his boots on stone in an oppressive silence that felt expectant. Between those impacts, there was nothing. No drip of water, no scuttling of unseen life. Even the hiss of the flame inside his lamp was swallowed at once. And the air, always the air, it stayed cool and fresh on his skin. A constant, impossible current, whispering from the depths, as if the mountain itself were breathing. He estimated he had descended 11 miles by the steady pace of his steps and the unbroken gradient. By his reckoning, he was deep in the solid heart of Mount Shasta when the rock beside him simply ended. In its place, caught in the trembling glow of his lamp, was metal. The passage walls became plates of polished, copper-like alloy, rising from the floor into shadow above. The surface caught his light and bent it, throwing back a distorted ghost of his face. His shuffle sounded different here, the echo closer, sharper, as if the space itself had hardened. He reached out and tapped the surface with his geologist's hammer, and felt a tremor run through him. It wasn't the dull thud of rock, but a clean, resonant ring, a note that seemed to hang in the air. Instinctively, he thought of impurities and grain, the flaws that give stone and metal their dead sound, and heard none here. This alloy, this flawless casting, was beyond anything any buried civilization could smelt, and beyond the furnaces of his industrial age in 1904. The thought left a cold, hollow space in his chest, as if some support he trusted had quietly given way. He ran his hand over the impossibly smooth, cool surface, searching for something familiar. Chisel scars, drill marks, the faint ripples of poured metal, and found nothing. The wall was as uniform as still water. The geologist in him understood. He wasn't in a mine. Mines are crude, violent gashes for extraction, strewn with broken stone. This place had proportions, intention, a symmetry linking wall to floor. This was a work of art. This was a monument. And he was about to discover who, or what, it was built for. He wasn't in a mine. This was a monument. The metallic passage ended in a sudden cut, and beyond it, the rock dropped away. His lantern pushed into emptiness, its glow swallowed by a cavern so broad it made the light feel small. Cool, still air filled the dark. The floor beneath him was worked stone. As he slowly turned, the beam picked out rows of doorways carved into the walls, stacked in tiers like the fronts of buried buildings. He let that impossible layout sink in, then chose the nearest opening and stepped inside. Metal flared back at him. The room beyond was packed from floor to ceiling with plates of burnished gold and shields of polished copper, stacked in neat rows along the walls. Each surface caught his flame and threw it around the chamber in warm, rippling flashes that slid over the stone and across his fingers. In that close stillness, even the scuff of his boot sounded too loud, as if he'd walked uninvited into someone else's vault. He pulled himself away and tried another doorway. This chamber replaced the rush of treasure with a colder question. Racks of tools lined the walls, long bars ending in spirals, forked prongs with flattened tips, curved blades set at awkward angles. He pictured his own hands around them and couldn't make the grip work. The handles were as thick as his forearm, the head so massive that just looking at them made his shoulders ache. Whoever used these had not been built on a human scale. Beyond that, the pattern repeated. Rooms opened off corridors, some empty, some holding more metal, some lined with alcoves, too tall for any ordinary sleeper. The layout felt deliberate, passages branching like streets, clusters of chambers grouped like blocks. Each step took him farther from shafts and surveys, and deeper into an underground quarter made to be lived in. The floor began to rise toward the cavern's center, until he stepped into a broader chamber that felt different the moment he crossed its threshold. This wasn't storage. It was a hall of state, set at the city's heart. His lantern beam swept the far wall and froze. Figures sat there on pedestals, caught mid-silhouette in the wavering light. For a heartbeat, he assumed they were carved. Then the glare steadied, and ribs and hollow eye sockets came into focus. They were skeletons, 27 of them. Seated, their skulls almost met the top of the doorway he'd just walked through. Standing, they would have been at least 10 feet high. The pale bone returned his light as a chalky sheen. His hand started to tremble, making the beam jitter across those long, waiting faces. He edged closer to the nearest figure. Tatters of a robe still clung to its ribs. The cloth looked solid until his fingers brushed it. Then it simply disintegrated, turning to fine gray dust that streaked his skin and burned his throat. The shock of it broke whatever story he'd been telling himself. This was no mine accident. No hidden tribe. This was a city built for these bones. A lost species the mountain had kept buried for thousands of years. He cried out and lurched backward. The lantern flew from his hand and went out. Darkness folded over the hall, leaving only the afterimage of those towering bones behind his eyes. J.C. Brown ran then, one hand on the wall, forcing himself along the black tunnel's 11 miles in a single panicked retreat. Daylight didn't free him. For nearly 30 years he told no one. The memory lodged inside him like buried rock, a secret whose pull only grew with time. He ran until the forest air filled his lungs, and the morning sun burned his eyes. J.C. Brown emerged from the mountain, not as an explorer, but as a man fleeing a tomb. He was trembling, covered in dirt, his mind fixed on those 27 silent figures. Before anything else, he went back. With a strength born of terror, he erased the entrance, piling rocks and dirt until his arms shook. The smooth-cut edges of the tunnel disappeared, and the opening blended back into the mountainside. He wasn't just sealing a cave. He was locking away a truth, hoping it would stay buried. For 30 years, it stayed buried. Outwardly, Brown went back to his surveys and reports, a geologist among rock samples. When talk turned to the age of the earth or human history, he would fall quiet, feeling that hidden chamber open again in his mind. At night, he saw them, the silent kings on their thrones, the oversized tools, the glint of gold stacked in the dark. How do you tell people that everything they know about their own past might be wrong? That a civilization of giants once walked the earth beneath their feet? He kept it, alone. By 1934, the Great Depression had hollowed out towns. Savings were gone, men stood in bread lines. Brown was 79 now, feeling his age in every step. Silence still meant protecting that underground city from scavengers and spectacle, but it also meant taking the secret into the ground with him, leaving no record at all. Speaking meant risking greed and desecration, yet it might also preserve the discovery and give a shaken country something beyond the next meal to imagine. In the end, he chose the fear he could no longer live with, dying as the only witness. One afternoon that June, he walked into the offices of the Stockton Record newspaper. He looked like just another old prospector. At an editor's desk, he unrolled a crinkled map and, in a steady, matter-of-fact voice, described an 11-mile tunnel, a city of giants, a room filled with gold. He spoke with the quiet authority of an eyewitness. Allegedly, he set a piece of the treasure on the desk between them. The editor picked it up, turned it under the light, tested its weight against the paperweight on his blotter, then set it down more carefully than before. The record would soon print Brown's detailed account. In a city used to foreclosure notices, the article didn't vanish into the back pages. People read it aloud in barbershops and boarding houses. Men began to appear at the record office, some with clippings in their pockets, others with questions about the old prospector and his map. From that grew an 80-man team: investors, unemployed workers, young adventurers looking for any excuse to leave town. They pooled what money they had for the journey. Brown refused to take a share. He would only be their guide, back to the mountain, back to the hidden entrance. The day of departure arrived. The camp was set, the air humming with anticipation. 80 men, their faces turned toward the mountain, were ready to claim a piece of a forgotten world, to change their fortunes, and perhaps history itself. All they needed was their guide. They waited, checking their packs, scanning the tree line for the old man who held the key to it all. They waited, and they kept waiting. Somewhere between the town and the trailhead, J.C. Brown, the only man who knew the way, had simply vanished. The story is usually cut off at the same place. J.C. Brown simply vanished. But the way that vanishing unfolded, the exact how and where, is what drags it out of a curious footnote and into the realm of the impossible. The final act didn't unfold on a lonely mountain trail. It took place behind a locked hotel door in the city of Stockton. The night before the expedition was due to leave, after a final planning meeting with his team, Brown was seen walking back alone to that room. He went inside, the door closed behind him, and from that moment on, no one would ever see him again. Dean Den on the 19th, 1934. Out in the cool light, 80 men stood waiting beside a small line of trucks on the edge of Stockton. They were men of the Great Depression, some of them literally down to their last chance. One account described them simply as men who had gambled their last dollar on Brown's fantastic story. Engines idled in low, uneven rumbles. Coffee steamed in tin cups. Men checked and rechecked shovels, ropes, and battered bedrolls, talking in quick, nervous bursts about the gold and the hidden city that were finally within reach. For a few hours, it must have felt like their lives were about to tilt in a completely new direction. All they needed now was their guide. But 9 o'clock came. And then 9:15. The chatter thinned. Someone who'd been laughing a moment earlier found himself watching the road instead, hands shoved deep into his pockets. A driver killed his engine to save fuel, then started it again, then let it die once more as the silence grew heavier. Men glanced at pocket watches, at each other, at the empty spot where an old prospector should have been walking up. The sun climbed higher. The old man who held all their hopes never appeared. Eventually, a small group broke away and headed for Brown's hotel. There was no answer when they knocked, no shuffle of footsteps, no irritated voice through the door. The manager was called, a master key produced, and the lock finally yielded. Inside, they stepped into a room that looked as though its occupant had simply paused his life and walked out through a wall. Brown's suitcase sat open at the foot of the bed, clothes neatly folded inside. His hat and coat were still hanging over the back of a chair. And on a small table near the window lay the entire sum of the expedition's funds, stacked and waiting, untouched. The Stockton police were summoned, and their investigation only carved the mystery into something harder, less easy to explain away. There were no signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture, no scuff marks, no blood. There was no robbery. Every dollar of the expedition money was accounted for, along with Brown's personal belongings. According to their report, the door had been locked from the inside. On paper, it ruled out almost everything. Not a crime of greed, not a panicked con man skipping town with the cash, not even an obvious kidnapping. J.C. Brown had entered that room after the meeting the night before, and then, somehow, he was gone. From that day on, the promised expedition evaporated, but the absence did not. The case settled into the records as an unsolved disappearance, while among the men who had been left standing by those trucks, another thought lingered. Brown had spent years warning that they didn't want him going back inside the mountain. speaking about forces that would stop him if they could. Whatever happened behind that locked door in Stockton felt less like a random misfortune, and more like the moment those private fears finally caught up with him. The locked room disappearance of J.C. Brown has resisted ordinary explanation for nearly a century. Was he quietly silenced by the very forces he'd claimed were watching him? Did he somehow slip away and try to reach the mountain alone, sacrificing everything rather than drag anyone else into whatever he feared was waiting there? Or did something else intervene entirely? Something that leaves no trace in police files, but bends events away from the paths we expect. If you see a pattern in what happened to him, I'd be interested to hear how you read this moment. For decades, that's where the story stopped. A cold case in a city file, and a kind of ghost story, traded among locals about the old prospector who knew too much, and then simply wasn't there. But the mountain he'd tried to return to was not finished. The strange pattern around it wasn't a one-time event. The legend just lay dormant, buried like everything else inside that rock, waiting to be disturbed again. And the next time a man vanished near that same part of the world, the circumstances would be just as impossible, and just as unsettling, as the morning those 80 men stood waiting for someone who would never arrive. That next time came nearly 65 years later, on May 25, 1999. His name was Carl Landers. Landers wasn't some amateur thrill-seeker. An experienced climber and marathon runner, he knew this mountain. On that day, he was in peak condition, well-equipped, pushing for the summit under a clear sky. For decades, Brown's story had thinned into local folklore, something people mentioned with a shrug. The mountain itself, though, seems to keep its own kind of memory. Landers was nearing a band of steep terrain called the Red Banks, a name that sharpens in retrospect, because it lies uncomfortably close to where J.C. Brown once claimed his hidden tunnel opened. His partners, a short distance behind, watched him pull ahead, a single figure moving out across a broad, exposed snowfield. No trees, no rocks, no crevasses. Just a wide slope of white, unbroken from one side of the horizon to the other. Minutes later, they followed his tracks. Boot prints pressed deep into the crust, a dark, oval path leading out into the open. Each step is a small reassurance. He was here. He passed this point. You can almost feel the moment they slow down, expecting to see him waiting somewhere ahead, and instead, seeing nothing. Just distance. Just silence. They reach the last footprint. Beyond it, the snow is smooth. The surface ahead is untouched, as if no one had walked there all winter. No second set of tracks curling away. No sign of a fall. No collapsed edge of a hidden crack. The line of impression simply ends in the middle of an empty field. On a clear day, in terrain that offers nowhere to disappear, a man is there 1 minute and gone the next, leaving a trail that refuses to tell the rest of the story. His disappearance is still listed in the California Department of Justice Missing Persons Records, and with the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Department as case number 199764, an open file containing a photograph, a date, and a set of facts that do not fit together. So what are we looking at here? A lost city of giants, seen once and never again. A man who walks into a locked hotel room and seems to dissolve from inside. A concrete seal poured over a mysterious shaft by an unnamed agency. And now, a solitary track across the snow that stops as if an invisible hand lifted its owner off the mountain. These don't feel like separate stories. They ring like echoes of the same deep note, resonating from somewhere inside this massif. The question may not be, what happened on Mount Shasta? The real question might be, who or what is at work here? Could the mountain itself be the guardian? A geologist's impossible discovery, a locked room disappearance, a climber's vanishing footprints in the snow, a modern shaft, burrowed in search of legend, now sealed with concrete. Taken separately, they look like curiosities from different eras. Together, they feel like harmonic tremors from the same hidden fault line. The previous question was who, or what, is the Guardian? Perhaps the secret of Mount Shasta isn't just what might be buried inside it, but the nature of the mountain itself. Not a passive stage for these events, but an active catalyst deciding who gets close and what remains behind. Beneath the folklore, there is architecture in the rock. U.S. Geological Survey mapping around Mount Shasta documents lava tube cave systems, including the nearby Pluto's Cave complex, a continuous tunnel rather than a single isolated chamber. That makes one part of Brown's 1904 story harder to dismiss. A man following a fissure in volcanic rock could step from daylight into a network of hidden passages large enough to wander, get lost, or decide he'd seen a buried city. The same unseen voids can swallow noise, light, and tracks as easily as people. A climber whose footprints end on blank snow may simply have crossed thin crust over a hollow, or slipped into a fracture that closed, leaving only an unanswered trail and a new story for the mountain. But physical structure alone doesn't create a guardian. Rock has no intention we can measure. Whatever motive we talk about can only be seen in human behavior and in the systems that react to it. In 2000, a study of visitors who described themselves as spiritual pilgrims reported that 89% said their main reason was to commune with underground beings tied to legends like J.C. Brown's. The mountain has become a magnet for that expectation, drawing people who meditate on its slopes, hold channeling circles, or simply sit and wait for a sign that some interior world is still listening. Once belief takes hold in a landscape like this, a loop begins. First, a story takes root that the terrain itself can plausibly hide. Brown's story of a subterranean city fits so neatly inside a mountain laced with volcanic voids that when he vanishes from a locked hotel room, the disappearance doesn't end the tale. It turns him into the first man the mountain took back. Second, that story pulls in people who feel compelled to test it. From a climber whose footprints simply stop on the snow, to the group who returned to Brown's supposed site in 2009, hand-digging a vertical shaft in hopes of breaking into his lost city. Third, those attempts trigger a response from larger systems. The U.S. Forest Service steps in and refills the shaft with concrete on public safety grounds and posts the closure. And finally, that response is read not as reassurance, but as proof. In conversations and online threads, the concrete seal and safety notice become Exhibit A, signs that there is a door here and that someone or something is invested in keeping it shut. Official caution feeds private conviction, sending the next wave of seekers back toward the mountain and closing the loop. Taken together, these patterns suggest that the guardian of Mount Shasta's secrets may not be ancient giants or a hidden agency at all, but something quieter, an emergent presence where stone, story, and institutional reflex meet. The mountain doesn't need to push us away. It lets us do the guarding instead. As rangers cite safety, locals steer questions elsewhere, and hikers doubt their own memories. Simply by watching and deciding what to believe, you're already inside that loop. There are places in this world that keep their secrets for a reason. If you want to explore more of them with us, make sure you subscribe,